The message opens by asserting a sense of divine immediacy and exclusivity, framing the listener's presence as neither accidental nor repeatable, but as the result of intentional supernatural orchestration. From the very first lines, time is compressed and dramatized. This moment is presented as uniquely significant, unrepeatable, and charged with consequence long before any concrete content is introduced. Urgency is not earned through evidence or argument. It is declared as a spiritual fact. By doing so, the message reframes attention itself as an act of obedience. Staying, listening, and continuing are implicitly aligned with faithfulness, while leaving questioning or delaying are subtly coded as disobedience. The listener is not invited to evaluate the message. They are instructed to submit to it by virtue of its claimed origin. Central to this opening is the positioning of the listener as chosen, a term that immediately establishes hierarchy and separation. Those who remain are implicitly elevated as spiritually receptive, aware, and aligned, while those who disengage are framed as missing their moment, lacking readiness, or failing to recognize divine timing. This binary is established before any substantive claims are made, ensuring that acceptance of the frame precedes engagement with the content. Skepticism is preemptively neutralized by redefining doubt, hesitation, or discomfort not as reasonable responses, but as evidence of the very spiritual condition the message claims to address. Resistance becomes proof, not counter-argument. Unease is not a signal to pause or reflect. It is reinterpreted as confirmation that something important is happening beneath conscious awareness. In this way, the introduction functions as a gatekeeping mechanism, sorting listeners into categories based on compliance rather than understanding. The authority of the message is not derived from coherence, consistency, or accountability, but from its asserted proximity to divine intention. God is portrayed as acting before danger appears, before awareness arises, and before the listener could possibly verify the claim, positioning the speaker as a privileged intermediary with access to hidden knowledge. This creates a structural asymmetry. The listener is always behind, always catching up to what has already been decided in the spiritual realm, and therefore always dependent on the message for orientation. The claim that the moment will not repeat heightens emotional pressure by introducing the threat of irreversible loss, not of a specific outcome, but of alignment itself. Missing the message is framed not as a neutral choice, but as forfeiting destiny. The introduction thus collapses curiosity into obligation. Listening is no longer an option, it is a test. The framing also subtly isolates the listener from external reference points. Because the message is said to be specifically for you, comparison, discussion, or verification with others is implicitly discouraged. If the message resonates, it proves selection. If it disturbs, it proves necessity. If it is rejected, it proves unreadiness. Every possible response is absorbed into the logic of the frame, rendering it self-sealing and resistant to critique. By presenting heaven as directly addressing the listener, the introduction bypasses institutional, communal, or interpretive mediation. There is no space for shared discernment, theological nuance, or contextual grounding. The listener is alone with the voice and the urgency it imposes. This immediacy is paired with exclusivity to create emotional intensity. You are here now. Others are not. You are being spoken to. Others are unaware. You can respond. Others will miss it. Such framing amplifies significance while narrowing cognitive freedom. Importantly, the introduction does not yet specify what action is required or what belief must change. Instead, it secures compliance at the level of posture. Before the listener knows what they are agreeing to, they are already positioned as responsible for responding correctly. Attention becomes moralized. Staying becomes virtuous. Leaving becomes failure. In redefining disengagement as spiritual failure rather than discernment, the introduction removes the legitimacy of boundaries, fatigue, disinterest, or critical distance. It also subtly shifts responsibility away from the message itself. If the content is confusing, overwhelming, or manipulative, the fault is not in the delivery, but in the listener's spiritual state. This inversion protects the message from evaluation and places the burden of meaning entirely on the receiver. The result is an opening that feels intimate and urgent, but operates structurally as a coercive filter. It does not persuade through clarity. It compels through implication. By the time the message moves into its main body, the listener has already been conditioned to interpret their reactions through the lens provided, making genuine discernment increasingly difficult. Time in the message is not presented as a neutral backdrop against which choices unfold, but as an actively collapsing structure. From the outset, time is framed as narrowing, tightening, and moving toward closure rather than remaining open or cyclical. The listener is told explicitly and implicitly that the present moment is singular and irreversible, a divinely arranged window that will not open again once passed. This framing transforms ordinary temporality into a high-stakes threshold where remaining or leaving carries disproportionate spiritual consequences. Time is no longer something the listener inhabits freely. It becomes something that threatens them with loss if not obeyed correctly. The assertion that this moment will not repeat is central to this construction. The listener is warned that if they leave now, if they scroll away, hesitate, or disengage, they will forfeit an opportunity that cannot be recovered. Importantly, this forfeiture is not defined in concrete or verifiable terms. The message does not specify what exactly is lost, how it is lost, or why it cannot return. Instead, irreversibility is treated as axiomatic, grounded solely in the claim of divine orchestration. Because the source of the claim is framed as transcendent, the listener is discouraged from questioning its logic. The consequence of leaving is left intentionally vague, allowing the listener's imagination to fill the gap with fear, regret, and anticipated loss. By declaring the moment unrepeatable, the message removes the legitimacy of future engagement. It precludes the idea that understanding might develop over time, that discernment might require distance, or that clarity might emerge through reflection. The possibility of returning later after thinking things through is denied in advance. This is a crucial rhetorical move because reflection depends on the assumption that time is available. When time is framed as closing, reflection becomes dangerous rather than wise. Pausing is no longer a thoughtful act. It is recoded as a failure to recognize divine timing. Delay in this framework is never neutral. In ordinary decision-making, delay can signify caution, uncertainty, competing priorities, emotional self-protection, or a desire for additional information. Here, delay is moralized. It is reframed as lost disobedience or spiritual blindness. The listener is not choosing between engagement and disengagement. They are choosing between obedience and forfeiture. This reframing eliminates a middle ground where the listener might observe without committing, listen without agreeing, or step away without condemnation. The message collapses a spectrum of responses into a binary stay and align or leave and lose. This binary is reinforced through emotional pressure rather than argument. The listener is told that the moment does not repeat, that doors are already closing, and that alignment cannot be postponed without consequence. These statements function less as information and more as coercive signals. They induce a sense of scarcity, a well-documented psychological mechanism that heightens compliance by suggesting that opportunity is limited and fragile. When people believe something is scarce and fleeting, they are more likely to act impulsively rather than deliberatively. The message exploits this tendency by framing time itself as the scarce resource. The removal of neutrality is especially significant. Neutrality is the space in which discernment occurs. It allows a person to hold competing interpretations, to test claims against experience, and to seek external perspectives. By redefining delay as loss, the message eliminates neutrality and replaces it with urgency. The listener is no longer free to ask, "Is this true, or does this apply to me?" Instead, they are pressured to ask, "What if I miss it?" The center of gravity shifts from truth to fear of regret. This temporal framing also shifts responsibility away from the message and onto the listener. If the listener leaves and later experiences confusion, dissatisfaction, or loss, the narrative has already assigned blame. They missed their moment. The content itself cannot be held accountable because the failure is attributed to timing, not substance. This is a self-protective structure. Any negative outcome can be retroactively explained as the result of disobedience rather than misguidance. The message becomes unfalsifiable because rejection is interpreted as error rather than critique. The claim of irreversibility also intensifies emotional stakes by implying that destiny itself is time-bound. Destiny is no longer something that unfolds through a series of choices, revisions, and learnings. It becomes something that can be irreparably damaged by a single moment of inattention. This dramatically raises the cost of disengagement. Missing the message is not merely missing information, it is missing alignment, purpose, or divine favor. Such framing can provoke anxiety, especially in listeners already sensitive to themes of calling meaning or spiritual responsibility. Furthermore, by insisting that this moment cannot be revisited, the message discourages external verification. If the opportunity is fleeting, there is no time to consult trusted friends, mentors, or alternative sources. Discussion becomes a liability rather than a resource. The listener is implicitly encouraged to remain alone with the message, reinforcing dependence on the speaker's framing. Time pressure thus serves to isolate as well as to accelerate. This narrowing of time also creates an asymmetry of knowledge and power. The message positions itself as aware of divine timing, while the listener is portrayed as ignorant of what is about to close. The speaker knows when the door is open and when it will shut. The listener does not. This asymmetry justifies obedience. If the listener is always behind, always late to perceive what heaven already knows, then questioning becomes foolish and compliance becomes prudent. Trust is demanded not because understanding has been achieved, but because ignorance has been asserted. The psychological effect of this structure is to replace agency with reactivity. The listener is not encouraged to act from conviction, but from fear of missing out on something undefined, yet framed as essential. Action becomes defensive rather than deliberate. The choice to stay is motivated less by agreement than by avoidance of loss. This undermines genuine consent because consent given under threat of irreversible harm is not freely given. The framing of time as irreversible also reshapes the listener's relationship to uncertainty. In healthy discernment, uncertainty is tolerated as part of the process. One can sit with not knowing, gather information, and allow insight to develop. Here, uncertainty is intolerable because it consumes the limited time available. The listener is urged to resolve uncertainty immediately by choosing alignment, even if understanding is incomplete. This creates a false equivalence between speed and faithfulness, suggesting that quick decisions are spiritually superior to careful ones. By presenting delay as loss rather than neutrality, the message effectively weaponizes time. Time becomes a disciplinary mechanism, enforcing compliance through the threat of disappearance. What disappears is never clearly named, which makes the threat more powerful rather than less. The listener is left to imagine the worst, a missed calling, a closed destiny, divine disappointment. Ambiguity amplifies fear, and fear accelerates obedience. Ultimately, this construction of time erodes one of the listener's most basic freedoms, the freedom to not decide yet. The right to pause, to disengage temporarily, or to withhold commitment without penalty is essential to autonomy. When that right is removed, decision-making becomes constrained and distorted. The listener is not choosing between alternatives on equal footing, they are responding to a manufactured emergency. In this way, the message does not simply encourage attentiveness, it demands immediacy. It does not invite discernment, it replaces discernment with urgency. By framing time as narrowing and irreversible, and by defining leaving as forfeiture rather than neutrality, the message creates a psychological environment in which compliance feels safer than reflection. The listener is pushed to stay not because they are convinced, but because the cost of leaving has been made to feel too great to risk. Language such as chosen one and phrases implying that this message knows your name function as powerful tools of individualized address, creating an illusion of personal intimacy while preserving a strictly one-directional flow of authority. On the surface, this language feels affirming, personal, and attentive. It suggests that the listener is being seen, known, and singled out in a vast and impersonal world. However, structurally, this personalization does not empower the listener. Instead, it isolates them within a closed communicative loop in which authority flows only one way and cannot be questioned, negotiated, or reciprocated. By addressing the listener as chosen, the message immediately reframes identity before any argument is made. The listener is not first presented as a neutral participant who may evaluate the message. They are positioned as someone already selected, already marked, already implicated. This positioning precedes consent. The identity is assigned, not discovered, and it comes with implicit expectations. To be chosen is not merely to be favored. It is to be obligated. The term carries weight, responsibility, and implied consequence. Once the listener accepts or feels compelled to accept the label, disengagement becomes psychologically costly because leaving no longer means rejecting a message, but rejecting an identity. The phrase, "this message knows your name," deepens this effect by collapsing distance between speaker message and listener. It implies a level of specificity that transcends the obvious reality that the message is broadcast to a wide, anonymous audience. The listener is encouraged to suspend awareness of scale and mediation. The technological and social context of mass communication is erased, replaced by the impression of direct address from a transcendent source. This creates perceived intimacy without actual relationship. The listener feels personally addressed, yet has no ability to respond in kind, ask questions, or influence the direction of the communication. This asymmetry is critical. Genuine intimacy requires mutuality, the ability to speak and be spoken to affect and be affected. In contrast, the intimacy constructed here is unilateral. The listener is exposed, named, and known, while the speaker and the divine authority they claim remain opaque and unaccountable. The listener's inner life is invoked emotions, fears, longings, but the source of the message is insulated from scrutiny. Authority flows downward, vulnerability flows upward. The individualized address also functions to isolate the listener from others. By suggesting that the message is uniquely for you, the framing subtly discourages comparison discussion or communal discernment. If the message resonates, that resonance is interpreted as proof of selection. If it does not resonate, the lack of resonance is framed as resistance, unreadiness, or spiritual dullness. In either case, the listener is pushed inward, encouraged to interpret their response privately rather than test it socially. External reference points become less relevant because the message is said to operate on a level others may not perceive. This isolation is reinforced by implied contrast. If you are chosen, others are not, or not yet. If you hear, others miss it. If you feel the weight of the message, others remain asleep. The listener is elevated by separation, but that elevation comes at the cost of relational grounding. Belonging is no longer horizontal, rooted in shared understanding or mutual accountability. It becomes vertical, defined by proximity to the claimed divine voice. The listener's sense of significance is tied to distance from others rather than connection with them. Importantly, this individualization also protects the message from critique. Because the address is personal, any objection can be reframed as personal failure rather than substantive disagreement. If the listener questions the message, the problem is not the message's coherence or ethics, it is the listener's unwillingness to accept their calling. Skepticism becomes a character flaw. Doubt becomes evidence of fear. Critical thinking is recoded as spiritual immaturity. In this way, personalization operates as a defensive mechanism, shielding authority by internalizing dissent. The language of being known also exploits a deep human longing, the desire to be seen in one's complexity and pain. Many listeners are drawn to such messages precisely because they feel overlooked, misunderstood, or anonymous in other areas of life. The claim that heaven knows their name offers emotional relief and validation. However, this relief is conditional. It depends on continued alignment with the message's framework. To remain known, the listener must remain receptive. To stay chosen, they must stay obedient. Intimacy thus becomes transactional, even if that transaction is never stated explicitly. The one-directional nature of the authority becomes clearer as the message progresses. Although the listener is addressed intimately, they are never invited to contribute meaningfully to interpretation or decision-making. Instructions are given, warnings are issued, urgency is imposed. The listener's role is to receive, respond, and comply. The personalization does not open dialogue, it forecloses it. The message speaks into the listener's life without allowing the listener to speak back in any way that might alter the message's claims. This dynamic creates a paradox. The more personal the address feels, the less personal agency the listener actually has. Being singled out does not increase freedom, it narrows it. The listener is encouraged to interpret their emotions, memories, and experiences exclusively through the lens provided. Personal history becomes evidence for the message's truth rather than a source of independent meaning. The self is not explored, it is reinterpreted. Another effect of this individualized framing is that it blurs the boundary between internal experience and external instruction. When the message claims to know the listener's name, their fears, their past struggles, it encourages the listener to merge their inner voice with the voice of the message. Thoughts that align with the message are experienced as confirmation. Thoughts that diverge are experienced as resistance. Over time, this can erode the listener's trust in their own discernment because discernment is only validated when it agrees with the external authority. The isolation produced is therefore not only social, but cognitive. The listener is cut off from alternative interpretations of their own experience. Emotional responses are pre-labeled. Confusion is framed as awakening. Anxiety is framed as alignment. Doubt is framed as fear. Once these labels are accepted, the listener loses the ability to name their inner states independently. The message becomes the primary interpreter of the listener's interior life. By claiming divine targeting, the message also removes itself from ordinary standards of accountability. If the message is from heaven and personally addressed, then questioning it becomes risky. The listener is not merely disagreeing with a speaker, they are resisting a calling. This raises the stakes of disagreement far beyond the content itself. The cost of critique is no longer intellectual discomfort, but spiritual consequence. In this sense, the intimacy created by phrases like chosen one is not relational, but instrumental. It is designed to secure compliance, not connection. It makes the listener feel special, while simultaneously reducing their autonomy. The listener is elevated symbolically, but constrained practically. They are told they matter deeply, but only insofar as they align with what is being delivered. Ultimately, this individualized address functions as a sophisticated mechanism of control. It personalizes authority without personalizing responsibility. The message claims to know the listener intimately, but the listener cannot know the message in return. There is no transparency about the speaker's motives, limitations, or fallibility. The relationship is asymmetric by design. By isolating the listener as uniquely targeted by heaven, the message removes the safety net of shared discernment and replaces it with a solitary burden of obedience. The listener is alone with the message, alone with the urgency, and alone with the consequences of response. What feels like closeness is structurally separation. What feels like being chosen is functionally being enclosed within a narrative that allows only one acceptable direction of movement. Below is a continuous single-paragraph analytical text in English written in a critical, non-devotional tone, approximately 2,000 words, with no line breaks directly expanding the idea you specified. Feelings of unease, resistance, or confusion are systematically reinterpreted as evidence that the message being delivered is not only true, but urgently necessary, creating a closed interpretive loop in which emotional discomfort is no longer a signal to pause, reflect, or question, but instead a confirmation that the listener is encountering something spiritually significant. Rather than treating discomfort as a complex psychological response that may arise from ambiguity, coercion, contradiction, or unresolved internal conflict, the message pre-labels these sensations as spiritual activation, conviction, or awakening, thereby stripping them of diagnostic value and converting them into proof of alignment. In this framework, discomfort is not an object of inquiry, but a verdict already rendered. The listener is discouraged from asking why they feel uneasy and is instead instructed on what the unease means, collapsing interpretation into obedience. This maneuver is especially powerful because it exploits a universal human tendency to seek meaning in emotional intensity. Strong feelings often feel important, and the message leverages this intuition by equating intensity with truth. Confusion becomes a sign that something deep is being revealed. Resistance becomes evidence that the message is confronting hidden sin, fear, or spiritual blockage. Unease becomes confirmation that the listener is standing at the threshold of transformation. At no point is the possibility entertained that discomfort might arise because the message is incoherent, manipulative, contradictory, or psychologically destabilizing. Those explanations are preemptively excluded. By redefining emotional friction as spiritual validation, the message immunizes itself against critique that might otherwise emerge naturally from the listener's internal warning systems. Ordinarily, discomfort functions as an early alert, a cue that something does not fit existing values, beliefs, or lived experience. Here, that alert is hijacked and reprogrammed. The listener is taught not only to ignore the warning, but to treat it as a green light. This inversion is critical. It trains the listener to distrust their own interpretive faculties and to rely instead on the message's explanatory authority. When the message claims that discomfort proves its truth, it eliminates the possibility of falsification at the level of experience. Any emotional response, positive or negative, becomes evidence in favor of the message. Peace means confirmation, disturbance means conviction, agreement means readiness, resistance means exposure. There is no emotional state that allows the listener to step outside the frame and evaluate it from a distance. This structure creates what can be described as emotional enclosure, a system in which internal states are constantly redirected back toward the message as justification for its authority. Importantly, the discomfort is not explored in content. The listener is not invited to articulate the source of their resistance, to examine conflicting thoughts, or to identify specific points of tension. Instead, the discomfort is immediately named and resolved through interpretation imposed from above. Naming precedes understanding. Once labeled as spiritual activation, the feeling no longer belongs to the listener as an experience to investigate. It belongs to the message as evidence to deploy. This prevents the development of reflective capacity. Reflection requires uncertainty, space, and the willingness to tolerate ambiguity. The message collapses that space by rushing to explanation. The speed of interpretation is itself a control mechanism. By moving faster than reflection can occur, the message ensures that its framing becomes the default lens through which the experience is understood. Over time, this conditions the listener to associate questioning with danger and surrender with safety. If confusion is said to mean that something is spiritually real, then clarity becomes suspicious. If resistance is framed as exposure of hidden weakness, then confidence becomes arrogance. The listener learns that comfort is not to be trusted, while discomfort is elevated as the mark of authenticity. This has significant psychological consequences. It destabilizes the listener's relationship with their own emotions by reversing the usual functions of emotional signals. Feelings that would normally prompt caution now prompt submission. Feelings that would normally signal coherence are treated as complacency. The listener becomes dependent on external interpretation to make sense of their inner life. Emotional autonomy erodes, replaced by interpretive dependence. The message does not simply tell the listener what to believe, it tells them how to feel about their feelings. This is a deeper level of influence because it operates upstream of conscious belief formation. By controlling the meaning of discomfort, the message controls the process by which beliefs are formed and revised. The listener's internal conflicts are no longer sites of discernment, but battlegrounds in which the message claims automatic victory. Resistance is not allowed to remain resistance. It must be converted into agreement through reinterpretation. Confusion is not allowed to remain confusion. It must be reframed as depth. The emotional landscape is flattened into a single axis of obedience versus avoidance. This dynamic also serves to protect the message from accountability. If discomfort were treated as a legitimate response, it might lead to questions about the message's assumptions, implications, or ethical coherence. By preemptively labeling discomfort as spiritual activation, the message forecloses that line of inquiry. The listener is subtly shamed out of analysis. To analyze would be to resist. To resist would be to reveal unreadiness or fear. The moral burden is shifted onto the listener, who must now manage their internal reactions in accordance with the message's demands. Emotional self-regulation becomes a spiritual duty. Any lingering unease must be worked through by deeper submission, not by external verification or dialogue. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. The more the listener submits, the more they are told their discomfort proves growth. The more discomfort persists, the more necessary the message appears. There is no exit condition. Even relief is interpreted as confirmation that obedience has succeeded, not as evidence that the initial discomfort may have been unnecessary or misdirected. The message thus claims total interpretive jurisdiction over the listener's emotional life. Crucially, this structure also isolates the listener from alternative interpretive communities. If discomfort is framed as a sign of spiritual truth, then seeking clarification from others who do not share the framework becomes risky. Those others may encourage reflection, contextualization, or skepticism, which would undermine the message's authority. The listener is therefore incentivized to remain within the interpretive bubble, where their emotions will be reliably translated in ways that reinforce the same conclusions. Over time, the listener may lose confidence in their ability to interpret their own experience without guidance. Emotional literacy is replaced by doctrinal translation. The self becomes opaque without the message to decode it. This is not accidental. Messages that rely on this mechanism often present themselves as offering deep insight into the human condition while simultaneously narrowing the listener's interpretive range. Complexity is reduced, but the reduction is masked as profundity. The listener is told that what feels confusing is actually simple, and what feels troubling is actually purposeful. This can feel relieving in the short term, especially for individuals who are already overwhelmed or searching for meaning. However, the cost of that relief is the gradual surrender of interpretive agency. Emotional discomfort, instead of being a doorway to understanding, becomes a lever for compliance. The message does not teach the listener how to sit with uncertainty, how to test claims, or how to integrate conflicting information. It teaches them how to reinterpret discomfort until it aligns with the message's demands. In doing so, it transforms the listener's inner life into a site of continuous self-surveillance. The listener monitors their feelings, not to understand themselves, but to assess their spiritual standing. Unease becomes a diagnostic tool wielded against the self. Confusion becomes evidence of deficiency. Resistance becomes guilt. The emotional world becomes moralized and weaponized. Ultimately, by pre-labeling emotional discomfort as spiritual activation, the message ensures that it can never be emotionally contradicted. There is no feeling that can arise which does not in some way serve the narrative. This is the hallmark of a closed system. Experience no longer informs belief. Belief interprets experience in advance. The listener's inner responses are anticipated, named, and absorbed before they can mature into critique. What appears to be spiritual depth is structurally emotional capture. The listener is not invited into greater awareness, but into greater submission, not through overt force, but through the subtle redefinition of what their own feelings are allowed to mean. Past teachings, trusted authorities, and previously chosen life directions are dismissed as incomplete, misguided, or subtly wrong without ever being clearly identified, named or argued against, creating a strategic ambiguity that destabilizes the listener's epistemic confidence while preventing any concrete evaluation of the claim. By refusing specificity, the message avoids the burden of proof. It does not need to demonstrate why earlier beliefs were incorrect, only to assert that they were insufficient for this season, this level, or what God is doing now. This vagueness is not a weakness, but a functional strength, because it allows the critique to apply to everything and nothing at once. The listener is invited to doubt their entire interpretive history without being given the tools to examine it. Past mentors, spiritual communities, intuitions, decisions, and even moments of peace are subtly downgraded, not as false in an obvious way, but as partial, immature, or obsolete. This creates a generalized sense of epistemic instability. The listener is encouraged to feel that what once felt solid may have been quietly flawed all along. Importantly, the message does not say you were wrong. It says you did not yet see fully, which feels gentler, but is more corrosive. It implies that the listener's past discernment was sincere but inadequate, which makes self-trust harder to recover because the failure is framed as structural rather than situational. If sincerity was not enough before, it may not be enough now either. As a result, the listener becomes increasingly dependent on external correction. This maneuver also inoculates the message against comparison. If prior teachings are dismissed without detail, they cannot be defended or contrasted. The listener cannot ask, In what way is this different? Because the difference is asserted rather than explained. The message positions itself as the missing corrective without specifying the error it corrects. This produces a one-way epistemic hierarchy. The message knows what was wrong, but the listener is not allowed access to that knowledge except through continued submission. The authority of the message is therefore not grounded in coherence, evidence, or argument, but in its claimed vantage point above the listener's past understanding. It speaks from a higher altitude where the details below are blurred and need not be named. This elevation feels convincing precisely because it is abstract. Abstraction conveys power. Psychologically, this destabilization has a predictable effect. When people lose confidence in their prior frameworks, they seek a new anchor. The message offers itself as that anchor, not by building gradually on what the listener already knows, but by implying that continuity itself is suspect. Growth is framed as rupture, rather than integration. To mature is to leave behind, not to refine. This framing discourages the listener from reconciling new information with old wisdom. Instead, they are encouraged to perform a quiet, epistemic break, trusting the present voice over the accumulated weight of experience. Because the critique is unspecific, the listener cannot repair or adjust their prior understanding. They can only abandon it in favor of the new authority. This is a crucial distinction. Repair preserves agency, abandonment transfers it. The lack of specificity also protects the message from being falsified. If a listener feels that a past teaching was actually healthy grounding or life-giving, the message can always respond that this does not contradict the claim, because the problem was not that the teaching was wrong, only that it was incomplete. Completeness is defined solely by the current message. Any counterexample can be absorbed without challenge. This creates a moving target where the standard of truth is not consistency or fruit, but alignment with the present authority. Over time, the listener may internalize a generalized distrust of their own conclusions. Confidence becomes arrogance. Stability becomes stagnation. Certainty becomes a sign of unreadiness. In this environment, perpetual openness is praised, but only toward the message itself. Openness in other directions is discouraged as distraction or regression. Ultimately, by declaring past teachings and directions partially wrong without specificity, the message performs an epistemic reset. It clears the ground not through argument, but through insinuation. The listener is left unsure of what they know, why they believed it, or whether they can rely on their own judgment going forward. Into that uncertainty, the message steps as corrective authority, offering clarity without explanation and certainty without transparency. The result is not deeper discernment, but a narrowed channel of trust, where knowing is replaced by following and understanding is deferred indefinitely in favor of continued alignment. Alignment, clarity, and accelerated progress are held out as rewards, but they are explicitly conditioned on the listener's ongoing alertness, responsiveness, and obedience, rather than on comprehension, discernment, or mutual reasoning. The promise structure is behavioral, not epistemic. The listener is not told that understanding will lead to clarity. Instead, compliance itself is framed as the pathway to clarity. Obedience precedes insight, and insight is portrayed as something that arrives only after submission has already been demonstrated. This reverses a common ethical or spiritual expectation that discernment informs action and replaces it with a model in which action validates discernment retroactively. If clarity follows obedience, then obedience is never required to justify itself in advance. This contingency creates a subtle but powerful pressure loop. Because the benefits are promised but deferred, the listener remains in a state of anticipatory compliance. Alignment is always just ahead, contingent on staying awake, sensitive, and responsive to the message. Any sense of stagnation or confusion can be interpreted not as a flaw in the message, but as evidence that the listener has not yet complied deeply enough. The system is self-sealing. Lack of results does not falsify the claim, it intensifies the demand. Progress becomes proof of obedience, and delay becomes proof of resistance. In neither case is the framework itself questioned. Crucially, understanding is not only unnecessary, but implicitly suspect. Rational evaluation, reflection, or request for clarity risk being reclassified as hesitation, dullness, or emotional interference. The listener is encouraged to act quickly, decisively, and without overthinking, because speed itself is moralized. Urgency is equated with faithfulness. Slowness becomes spiritual risk. In this context, obedience is not merely following guidance, it is performing readiness in real time. The listener must demonstrate alignment before they are allowed to feel aligned. This creates a compliance-first model of transformation, where interior certainty is always lagging behind exterior response. The framing also individualizes responsibility while centralizing authority. The message promises rapid progress, but only if the listener maintains the correct internal posture. If alignment does not materialize, the failure is internalized. The listener was not alert enough, not surrendered enough, not obedient enough. The authority issuing the instruction remains intact and unaccountable. There is no mechanism for the listener to conclude, "This guidance was unclear, flawed, or misapplied," because outcomes are never linked to the content of the message, only to the quality of the listener's compliance. This asymmetry preserves the authority's legitimacy regardless of results. Over time, this structure can erode autonomous judgment. When benefits are framed as contingent on obedience rather than understanding, the listener learns to prioritize correct response over coherent belief. They are trained to ask, "Am I aligned?" instead of, "Is this true or does this make sense?" Alignment becomes a behavioral state rather than an informed conviction. Clarity is something granted, not something constructed. Progress is something unlocked, not something reasoned toward. The listener's role narrows from interpreter to responder. Ultimately, the promise of alignment and clarity functions less as an outcome and more as a lever. It motivates continued compliance by holding out an ever-approaching resolution that can only be reached by staying within the prescribed posture. Understanding is postponed indefinitely while obedience is demanded immediately. In this way, the message does not cultivate discernment, it conditions responsiveness. The listener is not invited to see more clearly, but to move more quickly in the direction already defined for them. Liking, subscribing, commenting specific numbers, and sharing one's location are reframed as spiritually meaningful acts rather than ordinary platform mechanics. What would normally be understood as algorithmic engagement is symbolically elevated into the realm of obedience and alignment. The actions themselves are trivial, but the meaning attached to them is not. By spiritualizing these behaviors, the message collapses the boundary between faith response and platform interaction, transforming clicks into signals of spiritual readiness and compliance. This recoding performs several functions simultaneously. First, it disguises persuasion as participation. The listener is not told, "Help this video spread," but rather respond intentionally. Signal alignment or confirm what you are feeling. The call to action is framed as inwardly motivated rather than externally directed. The listener is led to believe they are acting from spiritual discernment when in fact they are performing predictable engagement behaviors that benefit the channel. Because the action is framed as spiritually initiated, the listener is less likely to perceive it as manipulation. Second, refusal is implicitly moralized. If liking or commenting is alignment, then not doing so becomes resistance, dullness, or hesitation. The listener is not given a neutral option. Silence is no longer passive. It is reinterpreted as a failure to respond to divine prompting. This removes the legitimacy of private reflection. Engagement becomes the visible proof of faith, while disengagement becomes evidence of misalignment. The framework does not allow for thoughtful restraint, skepticism, or quiet processing because those states do not produce the required outward signal. The use of specific numbers, such as 999 or 777, further intensifies this dynamic. Numbers are presented as carrying weight or meaning that will be understood later, which discourages immediate critical evaluation. The listener is asked to act first and understand afterward. Commenting a number becomes a ritualized gesture, a symbolic mark of belonging that requires no interpretation but demonstrates submission to the structure. Because the meaning is deferred, the action cannot be challenged on rational grounds. One cannot argue with a significance that is always just out of reach. Requesting location information extends the same logic into personal data. Sharing one's city or country is framed as testimony confirmation that the message is reaching where it is meant to reach. This creates a sense of participating in something larger than oneself, while normalizing the extraction of personal information. The listener feels seen and counted, yet the interaction remains entirely one-directional. The authority gathers visibility and reach. The listener offers exposure without receiving relational accountability in return. Most importantly, these engagement rituals reinforce the central narrative of chosenness and urgency. By acting publicly, liking, commenting, declaring presence, the listener performs their identity as someone who recognized the moment. This public trace increases psychological commitment. Once someone has acted, especially in a visible way, it becomes harder to later question the message without also questioning their own judgment. Engagement thus functions as both confirmation and containment. In this structure, platform mechanics are not merely hidden, they are sanctified. Algorithmic behavior is baptized as spiritual response. The listener is trained to equate faithfulness with visibility, obedience with interaction, and alignment with compliance to the message's demands. What appears to be a call into deeper spiritual awareness is also a system that converts belief into measurable engagement while framing that conversion as divine rather than transactional. Figures such as David, Esther, and Moses are repeatedly presented as universal templates through which the listener is invited to interpret their own life decisions and moments of doubt. these biblical characters are stripped of their historical, cultural, and narrative specificity and flattened into symbolic roles. The hesitant one who must act, the hidden one suddenly revealed, the reluctant servant who moves before certainty. By doing so, the message transforms complex, situational stories into moral shortcuts. The listener is not encouraged to wrestle with context, ambiguity, or consequence. Instead, they are offered a prepackaged pattern in which hesitation is equated with disobedience and immediate action is equated with righteousness. This framing creates a moral binary that collapses discernment into urgency and substitutes narrative analogy for ethical reasoning. In the biblical texts themselves, these figures are defined as much by uncertainty, negotiation, fear, and failure as by obedience or courage. Moses repeatedly resists his calling, argues with God, and expresses doubt about his capacity to lead. Esther delays action, consults, others fasts, and carefully assesses risk before approaching the king. David's story includes long periods of waiting, moral compromise, and catastrophic consequences for impulsive decisions. Yet in the message's retelling, these complexities are minimized or erased. What remains is a simplified arc. A moment arrives, action is required, and delay is framed as spiritual failure. The listener is invited to see themselves standing at the same threshold, regardless of how radically different their circumstances may be. This universalizing move functions rhetorically to remove the legitimacy of hesitation. If David did not hesitate, if Esther did not delay, if Moses moved forward when called, then hesitation becomes not a human response to uncertainty, but a moral flaw. The listener's internal resistance, questions, or desire for clarity are implicitly cast as faithlessness. The message does not allow for the possibility that delay could be wisdom, that restraint could be ethical, or that refusal could be faithful. By collapsing all action into obedience and all hesitation into disobedience, it forecloses discernment as a meaningful spiritual practice. At the same time, action itself is abstracted from its content. What matters is not what the listener does, why they do it, or who may be affected, but that they move. Action is valorized as inherently righteous, regardless of its direction. This creates a dangerous equivalence movement, becomes virtue in itself. The listener is encouraged to step forward, not because the path has been examined or understood, but because movement signals alignment. In this framework, action precedes understanding, and understanding becomes optional or even suspect. This mirrors the repeated insistence that faith requires movement before clarity, reinforcing the idea that certainty is something granted only after obedience, never before. The use of biblical exemplars intensifies the emotional pressure by embedding the listener's present moment within a sacred timeline. To hesitate is not merely to pause, it is to risk becoming the person who missed such a time as this. The weight of biblical history is brought to bear on ordinary decisions, inflating their significance while stripping them of nuance. The listener is no longer deciding whether to act in a specific situation. They are deciding whether to align themselves with the righteous heroes of Scripture or with the unnamed figures who failed to respond. This moral dramatization leaves little room for proportionality or self-compassion. Crucially, the consequences of action in the original stories are also selectively framed. Esther's courage is highlighted, but the political calculations and systemic violence of the Persian court are ignored. Moses' obedience is celebrated, but the immense suffering, conflict, and moral ambiguity of the Exodus narrative are left unexamined. David's rise is emphasized, while his abuse of power and its devastating aftermath are treated as secondary or irrelevant. By extracting only the moments that support immediate action, the message shields itself from counterexamples in which action led to harm, regret, or long-term damage. The narrative becomes unfalsifiable. Successful outcomes are proof of obedience, while negative outcomes are reinterpreted as trials, pruning, or hidden preparation. This selective storytelling also relocates authority. Rather than encouraging the listener to engage Scripture as a complex dialogical text, the message positions itself as the legitimate interpreter of biblical meaning. The figures are invoked not to invite reflection, but to enforce compliance. Scripture becomes a tool of persuasion rather than a source of wisdom. The listener is not asked to consider what these stories might reveal about patience, negotiation, or ethical tension, but to accept a single interpretive frame in which urgency overrides all other considerations. The psychological effect of this framing is significant. When hesitation is moralized as disobedience, the listener may learn to distrust their own caution boundaries or need for time. Anxiety can be reinterpreted as a call to act rather than a signal to pause. Doubt becomes something to overcome rather than something to explore. Over time, this can weaken the listener's capacity for self-trust and critical thinking as internal signals are consistently overridden by externally imposed urgency. The repeated insistence that delay equals loss trains the listener to associate reflection with danger and speed with safety. Moreover, the universal template obscures the reality that not all calls are the same, and not all actions are righteous simply because they are framed as obedience. In real life, acting prematurely can cause harm, sever relationships, or entrench false beliefs. The biblical figures themselves often faced consequences for actions taken without wisdom or accountability. By erasing these distinctions, the message promotes a theology of immediacy that privileges impulse over integration. Ultimately, presenting David, Esther, and Moses as interchangeable templates serves to sanctify the message's demand for action while insulating it from critique. If the listener resists, they are not merely disagreeing with the speaker, they are repeating the mistake of those who failed to act in Scripture. If they comply, their action is automatically validated by association with revered figures, regardless of outcome. This dynamic shifts responsibility away from the message itself and onto the listener's willingness to conform. The result is a closed moral system in which obedience is defined by speed righteousness, by movement, and discernment by compliance, leaving little space for the slow, difficult work of wisdom that the biblical narratives themselves so often portray. Past pain, rejection, loss, and confusion are consistently reframed as necessary preparation rather than as events that might have multiple contingent or even meaningless causes. Within this framework, suffering is never accidental, never excessive, and never the result of error, injustice, or misjudgment that could have been avoided or addressed differently. Every wound is retroactively assigned purpose. Every disappointment is reclassified as training. Every season of confusion is declared a hidden curriculum. This interpretive move does not simply comfort the listener, it closes the system of meaning so tightly that alternative explanations are rendered illegitimate or even invisible. By insisting that hardship was required in order to become who one is now, the message transforms biography into destiny. Pain is no longer something that happened to the listener, it is something that happened for them. Rejection is no longer relational failure, social mismatch, or systemic harm, it is divine filtration. Loss is no longer something to be grieved on its own terms, it is a necessary clearing of space. Confusion is no longer a sign that information was missing, guidance was poor, or decisions were constrained. It is reframed as incubation. In this way, the narrative absorbs all negative experiences into a single explanatory logic preparation. What makes this structure particularly powerful is not merely that it assigns meaning to suffering, but that it disallows competing interpretations. The possibility that pain might have been caused by someone else's wrongdoing, by chance, by immaturity, by cultural conditions, or by the speaker's own missteps is quietly excluded. These explanations are not debated, they are simply overwritten. To suggest that a loss was unnecessary or avoidable becomes equivalent to denying its spiritual value. To name harm as harm risks being interpreted as ingratitude, blindness, or resistance to growth. As a result, the listener is subtly trained to reinterpret their entire past through a single authorized lens. This produces an unfalsifiable narrative. Any outcome can be assimilated as evidence that the framework is correct. If the listener later experiences success, it confirms that the suffering prepared them. If they experience further struggle, it becomes proof that the training is still ongoing. If a decision inspired by the message leads to harm, that harm can be reframed as another layer of refinement. There is no possible counterexample that would invalidate the story because negative evidence is always reabsorbed as hidden good. In philosophical terms, the claim cannot be tested because no conceivable experience is allowed to count against it. The reframing of pain as preparation also shifts responsibility in a subtle but consequential way. By attributing suffering to divine necessity rather than contingent factors, accountability is blurred. If rejection was required, then those who rejected the listener are no longer fully responsible for their actions. They become instruments. If loss was ordained, then there is no need to ask whether different choices, boundaries, or interventions could have prevented it. If confusion was training, then misinformation, manipulation, or lack of support are retroactively justified. This can relieve anger and bitterness, but it can also short-circuit ethical clarity and the pursuit of repair. Emotionally, the narrative offers consolation while quietly constraining grief. Grief presupposes that something valuable was lost unnecessarily, prematurely, or unjustly. But if loss is always preparation, grief becomes inappropriate or excessive. The listener may feel pressure to move quickly from pain to gratitude, from sorrow to meaning. Lingering sadness risks being interpreted as spiritual immaturity, attachment, or failure to see what it was for. In this way, the narrative polices emotional timelines, privileging resolution over mourning and coherence over complexity. The same logic applies to confusion. Confusion is reinterpreted not as a signal that guidance was unclear or that competing values were in tension, but as evidence that the listener was being stretched beyond their former capacity. This removes the legitimacy of epistemic humility. Instead of asking, "What information was missing or who misled me?" The listener is encouraged to conclude, "I was not meant to understand then." This trains a posture of retrospective acceptance rather than critical evaluation. Past decisions are sanctified not because they were wise, but because they happened. By excluding chance as an explanatory category, the message also elevates control while denying it. On the surface, it reassures the listener that nothing was random, but beneath that reassurance lies a more restrictive implication. If nothing was random, then everything must be interpreted. Every event becomes a message, every setback a signal. This can generate a heightened sense of significance, but it also burdens the listener with constant meaning-making. Ordinary misfortune becomes spiritually charged, and ambiguity becomes intolerable. The listener is left inhabiting a world in which neutrality does not exist. Importantly, the narrative does not simply say that good can come from suffering, a claim many traditions would affirm. It goes further, asserting that suffering was necessary in the precise form it took. This stronger claim forecloses ethical questions about proportionality. Was the depth of the loss required? Was the duration of the pain necessary? Could growth have occurred with less damage? These questions are not allowed to surface because they imply that the process could have been otherwise. The narrative insists that the exact path taken was the only viable one. This insistence also reinforces loyalty to the present message. If all past pain was preparation, then the listener's current openness to this teaching is framed as the payoff. To question the message would be to retroactively undermine the meaning of one's own suffering. The cost of doubt becomes existentially high. If this is not what everything was leading toward, then what was it for? In this way, the narrative binds the listener's identity and history to the authority of the speaker. Acceptance validates the past. Rejection threatens to render it meaningless. Over time, this framework can weaken the listener's capacity to name harm accurately. When all negative experiences are reframed as spiritually productive, there is little room to identify patterns of abuse, exploitation, or systemic injustice. Harm is spiritualized rather than confronted. Misjudgment is sanctified rather than examined. The language of preparation can become a shield that protects not the listener, but the structures and relationships that caused the damage in the first place. In the end, the reframing of pain as necessary preparation offers coherence at the cost of openness. It provides a story that feels stable, purposeful, and affirming, but only by sealing itself off from alternative explanations. Because every outcome confirms the narrative can never be wrong. And because it can never be wrong, it never has to change, apologize, or account for harm. The listener is invited into a meaning system that feels redemptive, yet functions as a closed loop, one in which suffering is always justified after the fact, and the possibility that things could have been different is quietly but decisively erased.